Hey, you might have noticed that I'm not here today, but I'm here. Miss Karen and I are camping up in North Georgia this weekend and just thought we'd take Friday off so we could have a little bit more time just to relax and hang out a little bit. So I'm not with you, but I'm with you. And what we're going to talk about today, we finished yesterday talking about the Revolutionary War and the end of the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris of 1783. We talked about some people that were instrumental in the war in Georgia. We talked about those that signed the Declaration of Independence: Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton. We talked about the fact that Button Gwinnett couldn't keep his mouth shut, and because of that, he died in a duel. And so, as you can see, the title, we're free. Now what? What do we do? How do you become a state? How did Georgia become a state? How did the other 12 colonies become states? Because the process was pretty much the same for all of them. But we're going to focus on Georgia. First thing that anybody has to have, any new government has to have, is a plan of government. So the Georgia Constitution of 1777 is written by a committee. Button Gwinnett was on that committee. And it's based primarily on the principles of the Declaration of Independence, particularly those things that had to do with the natural rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that all are endowed with unalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That becomes the basis of the Georgia Constitution. One thing we have to say about it is not a constitution that is capable of supporting the needs of a growing state. It's really not a well-written document. It doesn't cover things that it should cover, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. It did establish 3 branches of government. You should know those without even having to think: the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. But they're not what we're used to today. They're not what we had in the or have in the U.S. Constitution. It's a very different approach to government. You're going to see that as we talk about it. Now, let's jump back to the Declaration of Independence. This is what it would have looked like when it was presented to the people. It is not that nice, pretty writing that we always think of when we think about the Declaration. It was basically printed in the newspaper, printed for people to be able to read, for people to be able to see with their own eyes and to comprehend it that way. The Georgia Constitution was presented to the people of Georgia in much the same way. They did not get the opportunity to vote on it, and that's something we'll talk about in just a few minutes, as it was a problem for the people of Georgia, for the government of Georgia. So what did the Constitution look like? What kind of things were included in the Georgia Constitution of 77? Well, most of the powers given to a unicameral legislature. In other words, it only had one house. Not bicameral like we're used to, like we think of, but unicameral, a one-house legislature. And the legislative branch had all of the power. They appointed the executive branch, which included the governor. There were other offices in there as well, but the primary one being the governor. And they also appointed members of the judicial branch. Now let's just pause for a minute and let you think about that. What kind of problems would that present in this new state if one branch has all the power? One branch actually appoints other members to the other branches. Just 30 seconds. You can discuss it amongst yourselves. I'm drinking a cup of coffee right now, by the way. If it's 8 o'clock, I'm drinking a cup of coffee, which wouldn't be unusual. All right, that was about 30 seconds. So The governor is not elected. He's actually appointed, as you saw just a moment ago. He's appointed by the legislature, and he only serves one-year term, which the moment he takes office, he is a lame duck officer. He's a lame duck governor. He's not going to be able to accomplish much because he doesn't have time. He's not in office long enough to really accomplish much. Each county, and there were not 159 as there are today, there were probably 8 or 9 different counties, really large counties in Georgia at the time. Each one of those had a superior court. And one of the things the Constitution does is it guarantees some freedoms. It guaranteed freedom of the press. That meant that the Georgia Gazette or the Savannah Daily News or whatever newspapers were named, they could actually speak out against the government. They were free to print whatever they wanted to print in their newspapers. People could say what they wanted to say without fear of the government coming down on them, arresting them, putting them in jail for speaking their mind. There's also freedom of religion. Remember, that's one of the things that Georgia is founded on back in 1733, this idea that people, unless they're Catholic, can come to Georgia and practice their religion, can worship God the way that they desire. And if you remember that intentionally, they didn't include Jews, but of course, Jews came and they were welcomed and were able to practice their religion. Another thing is trial by jury, and we take that for granted, but that's not always been a thing. The Magna Carta is where this started in England, and it was a right guaranteed every Englishman. And of course that came to the colonies, and it became a part of the United States as well. If you're arrested, you have the right to a trial by jury, still today. And in 1777, Georgians had that right as well. It had some strengths. I don't want to say that it was all bad. It did have a couple of strengths. There was a separation of the government branches. You did have distinct branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. And it did protect some basic rights, those things that we just talked about, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, a right to a trial by jury, those sorts of things. Those rights that are kind of spelled out in the Declaration of Independence as being natural rights, those are protected. It does have some weaknesses, though. In fact, it's much weaker than it is strong. The legislature has too much power. It actually elects the governor, it elects his advisors, and actually all state officials are elected by the legislature. It's just way too much power for any one branch of government to have. But yet, that's what they started with, and for at least a while they were stuck with it. And there's only one house. In other words, there's no way for any checks or balances to be put on that one house legislature. One of the reasons we have a bicameral legislature is that if a bill is introduced in the House, not only does it have to pass the House, but it also has to pass the Senate. And so there's this kind of give and take, check and balance. No one branch of Congress is more powerful than the other. That's not true in 1777. There was only one House in the legislature. And again, that 1 year term for the governor, he's basically just a figurehead. He has no power. He has no authority. We mentioned Button Gwinnett yesterday, and you can see by the dates that he served a little more than 2 months as Georgia's governor. Of course, killed in the duel with Lachlan McIntosh. Another weakness of the Constitution is it was not ratified by the people. The people of Georgia never had the opportunity to vote on it. And so it really doesn't represent who they are. It really doesn't represent their interests. Despite all that, despite all those weaknesses, it is the Georgia Constitution until 1789. So 12 years it remains Georgia's Constitution. John Trutland is elected governor after Button Gwinnett, and he's really the first governor elected by the legislature under the Constitution. So we could say he's Georgia's first constitutionally elected governor. Now, here's a question for you. Again, I'm not here, or I can't hear you. You can hear me. I can't hear you. But the Constitution of 1777 gave a lot of power to the legislature. Now, it's typically understood, it's typically thought that the legislature upholds the rights of the people. And so they gave power to the legislature and not to the governor. Why do you think that's such an important issue in 1777? Let me let you just 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think. Okay, so remember what they've come out of. They've come out of a government where the king is the ultimate authority. You've got one person who is the ultimate authority, and they don't want to see that happen again. And so rather than giving power to the governor, they don't give him any, and they give all the power to the legislature. Now, that's Georgia. What about the United States? What about the other 12 colonies? What holds them together? What they came up with in November of 1777, or what was presented in November of 77, was the Articles of Confederation. It is the foundation of this new government. Remember, the Declaration of Independence has a purpose, and that purpose is to answer the question, why? Two different questions, why. One is, why the rebellion? And the other one is, why the Declaration of Independence? And if you remember, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson both say, Locke said it first, Jefferson probably said it better, but they both said that it is perfectly okay. In fact, it is an obligation, it is a duty if the government is not protecting the rights of the people, that it be overthrown by the people, and then to be replaced with a new form of government. And so the new form of government that the Continental Congress devises is the Articles of Confederation. That becomes the foundation. It's at first written with a very strong central government, much like the monarchy that we had in England, except that there is no king, there is no president. It's just a very strong central government. A lot of states didn't like it. It was never going to fly. It was never going to pass. And so they went back to the drawing board and came up with a different idea. And the reason it was never going to fly is these people had just gotten their freedom. And they don't want to give it away to a national government that's going to control them. And so they changed it. That's the first page of the Articles of Confederation. All I can really read on that, because it's so faded, is to all to whom. Same kind of language that you would read in the Declaration of Independence, same kind of language you would read in the U.S. Constitution. So the change is a very weak central government that gave the states an incredible amount of authority over their own affairs. They pretty much ruled themselves. In fact, what you really had was 13 little independent nations. And really that's the case until after the Civil War. Again, they've experienced that British monarchy, and they don't want a central government telling them what to do. They want to be able to rule themselves, really rule themselves. So the Articles of Confederation is the plan of government. They had to have something, but it's very limited. And because it's limited, the government does not operate very efficiently. It does not run very smoothly. Kind of like me. Now the government does have some power, but you're going to notice it has much less power than you might think. They could do some things like declare war. Governments today, Congress still today, is the only branch of government that can declare war. They can coin money. They can make silver and gold coinage. And they can establish post offices. Here we go. I'm going to back up just a little bit because I don't know where I stopped. Okay, we'll go right here. So the government had the power to declare war. They could coin money. They couldn't print money, but they could make coins because they're based on a hard currency. They could establish post offices. They could send and recall ambassadors. So again, they could send Emma Kate to France, and they could call her home again as well. Things the government could not do because they didn't have the power to do was levy taxes, to impose taxes so that the government could operate, so the government would have money to pay their expenses. They had to ask the states to give them money. They could not compel them. They could not force them to. They couldn't regulate trade between the states. And so states would put tariffs or taxes on each other. South Carolina and Georgia, for example, would trade with one another, but they're placing tariffs on each other, taxes on each other for the goods that they buy and sell from each other. And even though they could declare war, they didn't have an army to declare war with. So the government could not raise an army unless the states gave them permission to do so. And so the country is basically defenseless. Now, some serious weaknesses. There's a strong legislative branch, but there is no executive branch. There's no president, there's no king, there's no chief executive. There is no judicial branch, which means there's no court system. So if the states are arguing with each other, there's no one to step in and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. There's no way to settle those types of disputes. Each state has its own currency. Remember, the federal government could coin money, but they can't print money, which means it has to be coinage, not paper currency. Congress could make law. That's what Congress does. But they couldn't force the states to comply with them. They could make all the laws they wanted, but the states don't have to comply. They don't have to live by them. And then, again, I think this is something born out of the problems with Great Britain. Each state got one vote in Congress, and it didn't matter how big they were. For example, Georgia, the least populated of the states, has the same vote as Virginia, which is the largest, the most populated of the states, which is not fair, and that's something that will be addressed eventually. Paper currency, you see New York up in the left, that's a $10 bill. That's good in New York. You see on the right, 12 pence, whatever the heck that is good in Massachusetts. Down at the bottom, you have a $40 bill from Georgia, which is probably good only in Georgia. So each state has its own currency. And so if you travel, if you trade, you've got to deal with different currencies. Great cartoon showing the weaknesses of the Articles. No national court system, no power to enforce treaties, no power to enforce laws, no power to raise an army, no power to collect taxes. They are just dead in the water. Now, this will be online. This will be in your notes online. Just a little T-chart gives you strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Strengths is the first written constitution. There is a legislature, and the state governments are strong. But the weaknesses far overshadow the strengths. The central government is too weak. There's no executive branch. There's no judicial branch. No one can enforce laws. No one can hear disputes between parties. Can't levy taxes. It's a weak union because there was fear of a strong central government. There's no checks and balances. There's no military because there's no taxes. They can't print money. The states have all the power, and each state has an equal vote in Congress. So, George Washington, of all people, said that the government is a half-starved, limping government. People realized this is just too weak. And George Washington I think one of his major frustrations as commander-in-chief or the commander of the army during the Revolutionary War is he's always begging. He always has to beg Congress for pay, for supplies, for this, for that, for everything, because the government's just too weak to supply. States argued over borders. They argued over trade. Congress can't stop them. They do not have the authority. They do not have the power to stop them. And this, to me, is the real telling weakness of the Articles of Confederation and of that government. Foreign governments didn't know who to talk to. They didn't know if they should talk with the legislature, the Congress, or if they should talk to the individual states. Should we talk to Georgia about trade? Should we talk to Georgia about whatever, rather than the federal government or the national government? And so it becomes very clear that something has to be done. We have to have something else. And so, in 1786, in September of 1786, Alexander Hamilton, by the way, you can go see Hamilton at the Fox Theater for about $1,000 a ticket. But anyway, Hamilton and James Madison called a meeting for the states to discuss their disagreements. I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, but you're part of a group and a meeting's called and nobody shows up. I have, and that's a pretty depressing thing to happen. And so they call this meeting, 5 representatives come. Another meeting is scheduled for May of 1787. This one is much more successful. And there's James Madison at the top, Alexander Hamilton. Madison is president in 1812 when the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain breaks out. Hamilton, of course, is killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. And, of course, they wrote the musical about Hamilton. Interesting guy. I'll tell you a little bit more about him later just because I find him really interesting. And so a constitutional convention is held. And that constitutional convention has as its intent to revise, to work with the Articles of Confederation. But as they look at it, as they read it, as they discuss, they decide we can't do anything with this, so they just wad it up and throw it in the trash. They get rid of it. And they write what we know today as the Constitution of the United States. And except for those 27 amendments, and really 17 of those were added over the past, 240 years or so, because the first 10 were written right after it was ratified. It hasn't changed all that much. It's changed with the times, but it's still the same wording that Madison and Hamilton worked with. Georgia appointed 6 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So they go to Philadelphia. At least some of them do. 2 do not attend. We're not even going to mention them. We know their names, but I'm not going to mention them. They're not worthy. 2 go, but they have to go. They have to leave early. They're called back because of issues in Georgia, family emergency, business issues. So they leave early. They never vote on the Constitution. Their names are William Houston and William Lee Pierce. 2, and that's who the arrows are pointing at, Abraham Baldwin, Baldwin County is named after Abraham Baldwin, and William Few actually signed the Constitution. They stay throughout the entire convention. They debate, they work, and they sign the Constitution. A couple of summers ago, I had the opportunity to go to Philadelphia. That's Independence Hall, and the left picture and the center picture. That's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. That's where the Continental Congress met. And I love the picture on the right. That's the desk that Abraham Baldwin and William Few sat at during the Constitutional Convention. That is where they worked to make this Constitution, to just make the Constitution, to make it workable, to make it real and viable. So, one of the things that we see in the Constitutional Convention is something that we're going to see over the next 50-odd years or so, and that is the art of compromise. To compromise. You give up something somebody else gives up something, and you're able to come to an agreement. And so there are compromises during the Constitutional Convention. There are exactly two that we're going to talk about. One is the 3/5 compromise. It's agreed upon by the northern states and the southern states, and what it did is it allowed slaves to be counted towards a state's overall population by counting them as 3/5 of a person. So technically what you were going to do, if you had 5 slaves, you were only going to count 3. Now, the question is why? Why 3/5 of a person? Or why only 3 out of 5 slaves? Again, it's a compromise. And you'll see that right here. The southern states wanted the slaves to count as a full person, which is interesting because they really did not view them as people. And they did not want to count slaves when it came to determining taxation. The northern states didn't want to count slaves as population, which again is interesting because there would be more people in the north that viewed slaves as people. And they wanted to tax states based on not only their free population, but their slave population as well. So the result is the 3/5 compromise. Slaves would count 3/5 in determining representation and 3/5 in determining a state's tax liability. But there's another one as well, and it's probably more important. It's one that has lasted, and that is the Great Compromise. It created a bicameral house, a bicameral legislature, where each state had 2 members in the Senate, but representation in the House of Representatives is based on the state's population. And of course, that's what we have today. It still works. Abraham Baldwin is one of the people that helped develop this Great Compromise, so Georgia contributes there. Smaller states were worried that they would not get equal representation, that their needs and their wishes and their voice would not be heard. And so the Great Compromise makes it fair for both large states and small states. Things are fair for both. And it's really a part of 2 plans. New Jersey plan, which wanted a one-house legislature, equal representation in Congress, and it's supported by the smaller states. New Jersey was one of those smaller states. They feared that if representation is based on population, then they will not be fully represented in Congress. The Virginia plan, 2 houses, it's bicameral, and representation in both is based on population. The larger states support this one. The compromise is a blend of both, a 2-house or bicameral legislature, equal representation in the House of Congress or the Senate, the upper house is what we would call it, the Senate, and then representation in the lower house or in the House of Representatives based on population. The beautiful thing about it is each state is represented equally or fairly. Maybe not equally, but fairly. And again, that still works today. So what does Georgia do? Georgians want a strong central government. In fact, they have to have a strong central government because there's the threat of Indian wars. There's a threat from the Spanish who have taken over Florida since Great Britain has left the continent. And so Georgia needs a strong central government. And because they are way down on the southern end of the states, they need some help in improving trade regulations. And a centralized government would do that. And so Georgia supports that strong central government. Wow. William Few, we haven't talked much about him. We're still not going to talk much about him. But he represented Georgia well by casting important nationalist votes during very critical times in the convention. And a nationalist vote would be one that looks out for the interest of all of the states, not just their own state. So, I'm going backwards. Don't want to go backwards. Sorry. So William Few, he also worked hard to make sure that the United States Constitution was approved by Congress, the Constitutional Congress, and by Georgia. And he's successful. The Constitutional Congress the Constitution is approved by the Constitutional Congress, and Georgia approves it on January 2nd, 1788, and it becomes the fourth state to ratify the Constitution. It becomes the fourth state admitted to the Union. So, that's how Georgia became a state. What I want you to do now, because that took about 30 minutes, a little more than 30 minutes, is in your textbook on page 39. Read from page 39, Georgia joins the Revolution, to the end of the chapter, page 52. And I'll give you some questions over what you've read on Tuesday. So, I'll see you Tuesday. I'll have the rest of your letters graded, and of course, I will have your vocabulary quizzes graded. And don't forget, you have a test on Friday of next week, the 18th, over the American Revolution and Georgia gaining statehood. So, have a great weekend. Don't forget to read. And remember, I love you, and y'all have a marvelous, outstanding weekend.